Good evening, everyone. We're just going to give it one more minute while we wait for people to join, and then we will begin this evening's webinar. Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to our Big City Butterflies of London webinar. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We're delighted to be joined by Kate Merry, Head of Volunteering and Engagement at Butterfly Conservation, and Simon Saville, Trustee of Butterfly Conservation and also Chair of our Surrey and South West London branch. Just before I pass you over to Kate, I need to run through a few housekeeping bits. Please note we are recording today's session and we are also streaming live to Facebook. Everyone except the speakers will be muted throughout. However, if you need help at any point, you can type into the chat box at the bottom of the screen, and where possible, we will help. We will also be answering questions at the end, although please feel free to submit them throughout. If you have a question, you can submit it using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to get through as many as possible in the allocated time. Okay, I will now pass you over to Kate to begin today's presentation.
Thank you very much, Becky, and hello, good evening, everybody. As Becky said, I'm Kate and I work for Butterfly Conservation as part of the engagement and volunteering team. Over the last 2 years, I have been working on a project that's really close to my heart, the Big City Butterflies project, which is all about discovering London's butterflies and moths. I grew up in London, and Wanstead Park in Redbridge was where I discovered nature as a kid. So it's really special to me that I've had this opportunity to develop a project that's all about helping others to discover nature too. So I'm just going to take a few minutes out to tell you about this project before we move on to the main event, which is Simon's fantastic talk. I should move that slide on. So here we are in London, or at least I'm guessing that some of you are, and the rest of us will just have to pretend for the moment. But this is the setting for this really exciting, groundbreaking project for butterfly conservation. Home to 9 million people, jam-packed into 607 square miles of urban metropolis. So at first glance, it might seem a surprising landscape for an organisation dedicated to the conservation of butterflies and moths to want to venture into. But here is London from a different angle. This fantastic map showing London's green space reveals that we have 37 triple SIs, that's sites of special scientific interest, 147 local nature reserves, over 1,500 sites of importance for nature conservation, and more than 3,000 parks and open spaces. 47% of London is green. And these green open spaces, these parks, squares, playgrounds, domestic gardens, they support wildlife. And they offer an opportunity for Londoners to experience and enjoy nature. So if I just zoom in and we'll take a closer look at one of those sites, let's go right in the heart of the city there. So nestled in the City of London is the wonderful Barbican Wildlife Garden, managed by a fantastic group of volunteers. If we go in a little bit closer, we'll see that it's a small but surprisingly tranquil spot where goldfinches bicker over the seed in the feeders and cut paths in the Wildflower Meadow invite you to explore. And if you were to follow one of those paths, you might just spot a common blue enjoying a quick nectar stop on a daisy. So those often overlooked moments are there all across London. London is green and does support a surprising diversity of butterflies and moths. The Big City Butterflies project is all about unlocking the full potential of London's green spaces for them so that more people can enjoy moments like these. And this is why we at Butterfly Conservation can't wait to get there. There are many exciting and significant opportunities for us. So through the delivery of the Big City Butterflies project, we want to help Londoners discover and connect with butterflies, moths, and the green spaces that support them. We want to improve the quality and connectivity of green spaces to increase their suitability for butterflies, moths, and other wildlife. We want to increase levels of recording and monitoring across London. And importantly, we want to increase the opportunities for us at Butterfly Conservation to engage with new audiences. So we're going to achieve these aims by delivering project activities across 3 main themes. And the first of those is engagement. And our engagement programme is going to involve work in schools with community groups, roving roadshows to public events. We want to get our message out there to as many people as we can over the 4 years of the project. The second theme is recording and monitoring. So we're going to be providing loads of training opportunities that will tap the huge potential to increase uptake of our established recording and monitoring schemes in London. And anyone will be able to get involved because we have schemes that are suitable for all levels of interest and ability. And finally, our habitat management activities. And again, through advice and training opportunities, we're going to improve the capacity of green spaces to support thriving populations of butterflies and moths. And we're really looking forward to working with the managers of green spaces across London's boroughs, and we'll be looking for opportunities to better connect those green spaces. So our project is going to focus on London's inner boroughs, and we have identified a network of what we're calling flagship sites that will form a focus for the project's activities. And 2 project officers will be recruited to deliver the project. So this project is really going to create 2 really exciting employment opportunities. The project officers, and indeed the whole project, has the full support and backing of our 4 fantastic BC branches that share London. I'm really quickly going to mention the pandemic, sorry. Our plans for the project's delivery were put on hold, like so many other things, with the outbreak of COVID-19. We are awaiting a decision from the National Heritage Lottery Fund, who are our main funders, fingers crossed, for the project, and really hope we'll be able to go ahead with the project early next year. Now, during lockdown, life slowed down for so many of us. Time spent in natural environments became precious. The People and Nature Survey for England, led by Natural England, is one of the main sources of data on how people experience and think about the environment. The results from the period April to June 2020 show that 85% of adults reported that being in nature makes them feel happy, and this was consistent across different population groups. Those who had visited a natural green space in the last 7 days reported being happier than those who hadn't. Big City Butterflies is all about encouraging greater connections between communities and their local green spaces. In a post-COVID world, the need for this project hasn't diminished, it's grown stronger. Butterflies are even frequently used as a metaphor for recovery, and we all need some of that, don't we, in 2021? So that's me finished my whistle-stop tour of the Big City Butterflies project. But before passing you over to Simon for the main talk this evening, I have to squeeze in a plug for the Big Give. So even if we're successful with our lottery funding, we still have essential match funding to find. So if you're able, please do make a donation this week and do it through the Big Give, because your donation will mean double to us. So we've got 4 days left. We've raised a fantastic £17,000, but we really need to get up to 30. So if you enjoy the webinar today, and you can, we would really massively appreciate a small donation. It would be brilliant to see that getting up to the 20k mark later on tonight. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening, and I will pass you over to Simon.
Thank you very much, Kate. I will now share my screen. Just wait for that to come through. So thank you, everybody, for joining. It's great to have so many people on the call today. As you can see, my talk's about the butterflies of London, and I've illustrated it with a number of photographs, mostly taken by myself, and mostly with my mobile phone. This one not is with a point and shoot camera, bit of a large skipper in central London. So we'll move straight on. There we go. So part of the reason for this talk is to debunk some of the myths which you hear about London, and indeed many of our towns and cities. When the London Wildlife Trust was set up in 1981, they were told it's a waste of time. You only find rats, pigeons and foxes in London. If you want to see the wildlife, you've got to go to the countryside. And that's basically not true. And I'll demonstrate that by illustrating what we can already see in London and how we can make it much better. This picture from Burgess Park shows a common blue. Burgess Park is a largish, newish park near Elephant and Castle by the Old Kent Road. So you could hardly be more central to London than that. just by London Bridge. So what I want to do, what I encourage people to do, is to explore and enjoy the local green spaces. I'm not suggesting you need to go very far. Get out to the green space near you and see what you can find. And although this talk is really about London, focuses on London and uses examples from South London, I think it's relevant to all urban centres across the country. And I use the hashtag nature under our noses to show that there's a lot of wildlife out there if we only take time to look. This is the content that I'm going to cover very quickly. We're going to talk a little bit about the wildlife sites we have in London, what sort of things, what sort of places you can go. Then we'll look back 40 years ago to the butterflies of London in the 80s. We'll look at the declining fortunes of butterflies. We'll look at butterflies in London now, take a couple of success stories, look at why London is quite good for wildlife and could be better, excuse me, and then start to think what we can do ourselves before having some conclusions. And if you've got questions, please do put them in the chat box or the Q&A box, and we'll try to answer them at the end. And I should say that if all this information on these slides, it is being recorded. If you want more details, my contact information is at the end of the presentation. You can get in touch and I'll provide what I can. So the area which I focus on, because it's where I live, is what I sometimes call Metropolitan Surrey. I don't think that's a real title. It's essentially the part of the county of Surrey before this was carved off and put in London. So it's south of the Thames in the southwest corner here. And you've got 3 boroughs called Inner London boroughs. You can see them here: Wandsworth, Lambeth and Southwark, which all go up to the river. And then 5 outer London boroughs: Richmond, Kingston, Merton, Sutton and Croydon. And you can see this is home to about 2.2 million people. It's quite a large space, 250 square kilometres. The amount of green space varies from around 33% to 62%. So you've got some quite rural areas, quite grassy areas, green areas, and some quite built up areas, particularly in the north. But what you've got here in this corner of London is very typical of the whole of London. So it's why I think you can extrapolate from what I'm saying here to London as a whole. This is using the same map that Kate showed earlier, London's green spaces, and the sort of habitats you get in London are mostly parks, commons, cemeteries, gardens, brownfield sites. Transport corridors quite important, and that's what I'm going to focus my time on tonight. Excuse me. There are 2 special areas, Richmond Park National Nature Reserve and Wimbledon Common, Putney Heath in the northern part here, and the North Downs Dip Slope and the South London Downs National Nature Reserve, a new National Nature Reserve designated last year, which is where there's some short grassland habitats and some really excellent sites for wildlife. Some of the best sites in London, indeed, 1 or 2 of the best sites in the country, I think. One of the characteristics of London is that there are relatively few land managers who are in charge of the green spaces. Obviously the boroughs, 31 of those. City of London Corporation manages sites not just in the City of London, but around London as well, and beyond, in fact. Then the Wildlife Trust, the Trust for Conservation Volunteers, National Trust, Royal Parks, all these have a hand in managing the green spaces, but there aren't very many of them. So it is possible to engage meaningfully with these people. And importantly, nearly all the green spaces in London have a friends group, Friends of Burgess Park, for example. These are active groups. They're normally very effective in helping to manage the wildlife and the parks, and they do a huge amount of good work. This slide is here to illustrate the scale of butterfly monitoring that goes on in this corner of London in the southwest. There are over 30 regular monitoring walks done, 26 times a year each one in a good year. So you can see the whole area is well monitored for butterflies, and this list of sites, which I'm not going to go through, is really an example of some of the best sites in the area. So if you wanted to go to places to look for butterflies, this would be the sort of sites I would suggest you go to. If you look back, let's take a look back now at what London was like in the 80s and a bit before. This is work done by the London Natural History Society, and published in Common Plants book in 1987, they used a slightly different definition of inner London to the one I've used, but it's broadly the same. And they listed 21 butterflies as being present in London at that time. And you can see the list here, most of the ones that you would expect, the widespread species that we have in the country. They're all there today, except the wall brown, which is, as most of you would know, I expect, is declined massively on a national scale, and is no longer found in London or indeed in Surrey, although we do get the odd sightings of, I think, migrants or vagrants. And that situation is reflected in the decline of butterflies throughout the country. This is England, all of England, and we're talking about wider countryside species here, 21 species in this report, indexed back to 1990. And you can see the decline of these species that were common in farmland since that time. And you can see the percentage of the species which have declined versus increased, and you see it's a pretty sorry story. If we go to woodland species, for the same for England as well, the decline is even greater. And I think this is down to the changing woodland management practices that we've had over the years. So butterflies declining overall, but what's happening in London? Well, now we regularly can see over 25 species of butterfly in London, particularly in those three boroughs that I mentioned, Wandsworth, Lambeth and Southwark. And it's the ones listed earlier, plus the ones in blue here, the brown argus, purple hairstreak and white-letter hairstreak, both of which are quite prevalent. The marbled white, another success story, and the ringlet. And you can see the picture there of the nice Essex skipper being stalked by a crab spider on thistles in Burgess Park, which I mentioned before, which is indeed one of the flagship sites for big city butterflies. So it looks like the numbers of species in inner London is increased versus the past. I'm just going to go through those species so that those of you who aren't so familiar get an idea of the sort of things that we see. So these would be some of the more familiar butterflies to most people, I think. The hibernators, they spend the winter as adult butterflies, hiding away in outhouses and under the eaves or in ivy or in bushes or wherever. Red admiral could be seen in any month of the year. It's seen on every day of the year, really, somewhere. That comes out when the sun comes out, even in November, December, January, February. The peacock and the small tortoiseshell, these are butterflies which I don't think like the warm weather, and they tend to go into hibernation very early, as early as July. We know we can find the roosting sites for those. And they're much less, the small tortoiseshell in particular, much less common than previously. What people speculate as the reasons for that. The comma, on the other hand, is much more prevalent now than it used to be. Its caterpillars now feed on nettles as well as hop and elm trees, and the wider availability of nettles has allowed this butterfly to spread, and it's pretty widespread across London, and it's a joy to see that in the spring. Probably see more of those than we do of the others. And the brimstone is seen occasionally in inner London. There isn't so much buckthorn, the tree which the caterpillar of the brimstone feeds on. And if we were to plant more buckthorn, then we get more brimstones. But you do see it occasionally in the parks, the bigger parks especially. The five whites, brimstone included here as well. These can be very confusing even to the experienced butterfly spotter. You can see the large white on the left and then the orange tip. The female here doesn't have the orange markings on the forewings. This butterfly caterpillar feeds on garlic mustard, and if there was more of that, we would have more of the orange tip around as well, I think. Then the green veined white and the small white. The small white is one of our commonest butterflies, not just nationally, but it's here in London as well, and can be seen almost everywhere. In every 1 kilometre square, I think there are small whites visible, and they roam across the countryside or the London cityscape, feeding on many different plants as caterpillars. These small brown butterflies, the skippers, and some of the ones in the blue family, large skipper on the left, and then an Essex skipper in the middle with antennae with the black tips, very characteristic, and then a small skipper on the right. These skippers love to feed on thistle, as you can see, very important nectar plant in wildflower meadows. Brown Argus on the left is a success story I'll talk about. Lovely little butterfly becoming more widely seen. Common blue, Kate showed one of those in Barbican Gardens. This one's in Burgess Park. The female has a variety of different forms, range from all brown to pretty much all blue. And then on the right, the small copper, which breeds throughout the summer and can be seen in damper spaces where dock and sorrel are growing. The two blues we see commonly in London are the common blue and the holly blue. The common blue in many of the parks, and the holly blue is like the small white. It can be seen almost anywhere. These are both females on the bottom here. It has the black tips to the wings. And this butterfly, its caterpillars feed on many, many different plants. Holly in the spring, in the summer brood, and ivy in the autumn. But here the female is laying egg on lucerne in Burgess Park. So it will take lots and lots of different things, and that probably is a reason for its success. These canopy species weren't listed in Common Plants Book back in the 80s as being common. They're now pretty widespread. I'll talk more about the white-headed hairstreak later. It feeds on elm. The purple hairstreak on the right feeds on oak. And there are parts of London like Tutankhamun near Balham where this butterfly is really quite common. And you can see it, particularly if you go looking at 7 o'clock in the evening on a July day, you can see this butterfly flying quite good numbers on the tops of the trees there, or at Streatham Common or other places where there are lots of oaks. And then the browns, I always think these are prettier than people think they are when you look at the names. But the gatekeeper is pretty widespread. Meadow brown and speckled wood. Marbled white's a success story I'll talk about. The ringlet moving in, it's less common, but still there, and the small heath. But some of these butterflies are struggling a little bit, or maybe struggling in the future. The gatekeeper, which is typically a butterfly seen in July, its first emergence is normally around the beginning of July, loves to nectar on bramble flowers. Well, here in London, because of global warming and the urban heat island effect, the bramble flowers are often over in July, and this year I was picking the first blackberries on the 1st of July. So there's a risk of the butterfly getting out of sync with its main nectar food source in the summer. Something to watch. And these migrants, painted lady, which we sometimes see in very large numbers, back in 2009, for example, and then the red admiral, it's a migrant, comes here every year, but also breeds here now, and I'm told it lays eggs in every month of the year now in the UK. And the clouded yellow we don't see very much in inner London, but is present, particularly in the south of the area. And here's some possible new residents of the inner London area. These butterflies were all seen this year and last. The white admiral, brown hairstreak, and silver wasp fritillary, really woodland species. But there are some quite nice woodlands on Tooting Common and at Stayfield Ecology Park and other places around. And they may well be moving in, or they may just be passing through. But the brown hairstreak, we found eggs on the commons. So we believe these are now resident in inner London, which is quite exciting to see. I now want to just give you a couple of success stories to show what can be done, and therefore what the potential is for butterflies in London if we could do more to manage the habitats more effectively. So I've got 3 species here to look at. I've mentioned them already: the white-letter hairstreak, the marbled white, and the brown argus. And I'll talk a bit about Burgess Park because it's an example of what's been done and can be done well elsewhere as well. So first of all, the white-letter hairstreak. As I think I said before, the caterpillars feed only on elm, and it was decimated, this butterfly, by the Dutch elm disease in the 70s. And it was thought, people thought then, that wiped out elms from the whole countryside. There were none left. It's not true. There are actually quite a lot of elms, and they've regenerated from those the rootstocks and so on that were present. Elms are tricky to identify in the summer, but in the spring, they stand out like beacons. And this one in Battersea Park, you can see here, is very conspicuous because it's in fruit. So what we did was we sought the databases from the borough tree offices of where their trees are. They've all got those. We then went and looked in the spring in March, April, when the trees are in fruit, checked the locations of GPS, checked the species of elm and condition and whether the canopy was visible. And then went back in the summer, June, July, to look for adult butterflies. They come out at about end of the first week of June here, and some egg searches in winter as well. And then we reported our results back. And what we found was actually there's lots of elms in South London. Many of the parks, many of the cemeteries, some of the roadsides indeed have got elms of all different types, English elm, wych elm, Huntingdon elm. But increasingly in the last couple of decades, the boroughs have been planting disease-resistant elms, which don't succumb so much to Dutch elm disease. And across these elms, we've now found many white-lead hair streak colonies, Tooting Common, Peckham Rye Park, Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens. And this is why the butterfly is hard to spot, because there it is sitting by, you see this red arrow, sitting there on an elm leaf, and they'll fly up into the air, and two males will have a battle, and then they'll fly and go away, and you won't see them again for a few minutes. Quite hard to spot if you don't know what you're doing, quite easy if you've got your eye in, as I should say. So this is a comparison of the distribution of white-headed hair streak from 2016 to 18 to earlier. If I go back to before this date, we only had records from 3 squares in that period, and now it's almost everywhere. And I think the spaces where there are gaps are just because we haven't done enough monitoring. But the white-headed hair streak really become quite prevalent. Obviously, this is largely down to recorder effort as well as spreading, but I think it's a combination of the elms coming back, more disease-resistant elms being planted, and us looking for them. This is an example of how that butterfly could survive in a very urban habitat, which is why big city butterflies make so much sense. This is Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens by Vauxhall Station, right next to the Thames, about 100 meters from the MI5 building on the Thames. And this is a stand of around 25 disease-resistant elms of the New Horizon cultivar, and the white-headed hair streak lives on the elms over here. And you can see them in July if you want to go, if you go there with a few minutes to spare. So that's good news. And as a result of our discussions with the borough ecology officers, they've changed the planting palette and we're now keen to plant more elms across their parks and areas, because they know that will encourage the white-headed hair streak to move in. Now the marbled white. This appears to be extending its range. It's not just a London story, but it's now seen in many parks where it wasn't seen before. And part of that is due to the management of the grasslands, because its caterpillars feed on grasses like red fescue, with a photo there, and it likes tall, unimproved grassland with lots of nectar sources in it. And you can go to places in London and see dozens of these butterflies flying now. But the grassland management is quite important because, as you can see from the diagram below, this butterfly spends most of its life as a caterpillar, nearly 11 months as a caterpillar. So you need to have those grasses available for the caterpillar to feed on through August and into September, and then have grass areas where it can hibernate through October, November, December, and so on. So if you cut the grass too early, then you'll just kill off this species. So grassland management is really important to this butterfly, and that's where I think we've got better as councils understand more what needs to be done. You can see that that's improving. This is an occupancy trend, essentially how the distribution of the marbled white is increasing. This is shows the percentage of the squares which are occupied by the butterfly. So it shows in this area of essentially old Surrey that 2/3 of the squares are now have records of marbled white. It's a massive increase. So there's something going on there. Maybe it's global warming. It could be, and I think it's also grassland management helping as well. Clear that if we manage more grassy areas and more parks better, we will see more marbled whites. And then the brown argus is a little butterfly. It's quite hard to spot, quite often confused with the common blue. This has been seen in Burgess Park and Tooting Common the last few years, which surprised us because historically this has been thought of as a chalk downland specialist butterfly, feeding as a caterpillar on rock rose. But now these caterpillars seem to use geranium species like dove's foot cranesbill, and because that's a more prevalent plant, and it's often in the wildflower mixings which grow in parks, it's moved in. And it shows that these butterflies are able to move quite long distances, even the small ones, to find new habitats. So 3 butterflies there which are doing quite well. And then a picture of Burgess Park. Kate had a picture of 2 common blues mating at the very beginning of her presentation, also from Burgess Park. This is the marbled white, obviously. This park, which is quite a large park, as I said, very urban, in one of the most densely populated parts of London, it's been transformed over the last few years because the council's looked after it better. ID Verdi, who are the land managers there on behalf of the council and the Friends group, do a fantastic job. But now it provides a variety of habitats, from pollinator banks to wildflower grasslands, to scrub and wooded areas, even got some elms and some white-headed hair streaks. And there are some oak trees. I haven't yet found purple hair streak, but I think I probably would if I looked for long enough. So at least 22 species of butterfly now in this park, and also plenty of other wildlife as well. And this park shows really what the potential of the Big City Butterflies project is all about. There's no real reason why a park of any size, say a hectare, a couple of football pitches size, no reason why a park like that, with appropriate management, couldn't support 20 or so species of butterfly. Quite possible. And I have a kind of vision that would be present in every park, 20 plus species of butterfly. It would be wonderful. So just to summarize where we've got to so far, some butterflies appear to be spreading their range in London. There seem to be more species here than there were 30 or so years ago. And we can identify some specific reasons for that, like elm regeneration or larval food plant changes and so on. But I think there are probably more general reasons for these changes, and I want to take a look at those now. And they're to do with the nature of London, really, because London has really good potential for wildlife. The main challenges it faces around development pressures, because there's so many new housing and buildings going on. But Kate's already demonstrated it's a very green space, 47% green. But most importantly, these green spaces are relatively stable. They're parks, the cemeteries, the gardens, the brownfield sites. They're not getting built on, getting built close to, and taller buildings and more people getting close to them. But the footprints of these sites tends to be staying the same, particularly the good ones. You've got lots of transport corridors, rail, road and water, which provide connectivity for wildlife. And I think, I don't have hard data on this, but I think that the chemical use in parks has been reducing. The boroughs I speak to around here certainly don't, they say they don't routinely use pesticides in their parks. They do use pesticides on the streets, that's another story, but they don't use them in the parks so much now. That's good news. I think in general, the management part of parks is more sensitive to wildlife now. You see more wildlife areas. They refer to changing planting palettes and mowing regimes which encourage wildflower meadows, longer grasses and so on. So not expensive to do, but make a big difference to the wildlife that's present. And then I mentioned before also the urban heat island effect. London is typically 4 to 7 degrees warmer than the surrounding countryside, sometimes more. We haven't had a frost yet this year. The minimum temperature we've had here in inner London has been 3 degrees so far. So it's a very benign temperate climate, which can be good and can be bad. But it means in the summer, it tends to be warm and dry. And then although development is a lot of pressure, there are also some controls, and the concept of biodiversity net gain in planning is quite well embedded, and there are some examples of some very good projects which have led to improvements in wildlife, say Woodbury wetlands or somewhere like that. And all the while, and you can see here is a Jersey tiger moth. This is a moth that was first seen in South London about 15 years ago, and now is seen everywhere across the capital, and indeed spreading widely further. So here's another, just quickly on Green London. The data on the left is what Kate showed earlier, but over 15,000 species have been recorded in London, obviously not butterflies and moths, but all species recorded. And London Wildlife Trust, I've heard them say that London is possibly the most biodiverse area in Britain because of the variety of habitats it's got in a relatively compact space. So it's a good place for wildlife. It could be much better, which again is the reason for doing big city butterflies. So how can you help? What could you do to get involved? Well, you could look at the Wildlife Trust's Action for Insects campaign, a very good campaign. Shows a few things you can do. And I picked out 5 simple things that work for any green space, whether it be your garden, a community space in a housing estate, a road verge, roundabout, or a park, or a cemetery, or churchyard, or whatever. Wherever there's green space, you could do these things, or lobby for it to be done by the land managers. The first thing, and particularly if you've got a small space, is food for adult butterflies, moths, insects. That means nectar plants, and that means nectar all through the season. So you need to have it there, nectar there early in the season when the hibernators come out. You need the nectar to be there in the late season when some of the butterflies are still flying. So that's why ivy is such an important plant for that and other reasons, but it's a great nectar source late in the season. You'll see red admirals nectaring on ivy in October and November, even ivy mining bees as well, all sorts of things. Then what I call feeding the kids. So you need food plants for the caterpillars. This is probably the biggest issue, and what the most important thing to do if you can is to create the right food plants for the caterpillars. And I'll show some examples in the next page. Just the image there is of a garlic mustard plant with an orange tip egg, just visible, the orange, the pointed orange egg shape. Very easy to spot in the spring if you know what you're looking for. Then we need to provide shelter. So butterflies and moths need shelter overnight, and in bad weather they need somewhere to go when it rains. And that means longer grasses, it means shrubby areas, it means trees and woodlands, it means hedges, and again ivy is really important for that. And they need somewhere to spend the winter. The butterflies must spend the winter in one form or another as either an egg, a caterpillar, a chrysalis, or the adult. We've talked about the 5 adult butterflies which overwinter as adults, but they need to spend somewhere to find. So you need to think about what are their requirements over the winter. So if you cut the long grass too soon, you won't have the places for the caterpillars to hide away. Again, I'll come on to that again in a minute. And then using no chemicals, easy to do. The hint is in the name, insecticides kill insects, so let's not use them. And if you want to improve biodiversity overall in a green space, we generally reckon that a pond over small is the best thing you can add. And so that's highly recommended. The thing to remember is that if it's good for butterflies, it'll be good for insects. If it's good for insects, it'll be good for other wildlife. And it's good for wildlife, it's good for us. So there's all sorts of good reasons for doing this and getting involved. So how do butterflies spend the winter? What do you need to do to make sure there's space for them in the winter months? So I looked at 24 species that breed in inner London, and we've talked about the 5 that spend the winter as an adult. There are 3 which overwinter as an egg, the 2 hair streaks and the Essex skipper, and 6 as a chrysalis, the white butterflies, speckled wood. But most of these, the biggest number, is caterpillars. So thinking where these caterpillars, which are mostly tiny, where they're going to hide away in the winter months, that's really important. So having those grassy areas left and some scrubby areas left is really important for these caterpillars. Very difficult to find. And here's the caterpillar food plant list. It's not a very long list, actually. I cheated by putting trees in on one line, but you don't need to think about many different types of plant to cater for all of London's butterflies. So the grasses, different types of grasses that you get in wildflower meadows, as long as you haven't got the denser ryegrass and so on. That's the first thing. A lot of the brown butterflies feed on those. Nettles for the red admirals and the peacocks and the tortoise shells. Nasturtiums and brassicas for the whites. The love allotments. Birdsfoot trefoil, etc. for the blues. Garlic mustard or cuckoo flower for the orange tip. Sorrel and dock for the small copper. Geranium species for the brown argus. Thistles for the painted lady. Ivy for the holly blue. The trees there, oak for purple hairstreak, buckthorn for the brimstone, and elm for the white-letter hairstreak. So we know if we plant more elms, we will see more white-letter hairstreaks. We know if we put more buckthorn in, we will see more brimstones. It's as sure as eggs that plant it, we'll see more of these butterflies in those areas. This refers to Burgess Park and its management again. And you can see a picture, it's a winter picture I know from 2017, and 2 years later in the summer. So an amenity grassland and then a wildflower meadow. This area was teeming with wildlife. You can see the sort of flowers and thistles and so on which are growing there. Butterflies, burnet moths, cinnabar moths, bees, spiders, hoverflies, rose chafers, all those sort of things. And with that, the birds come along as well. So totally transformed. And that's done by managing the grassland to create wildflower meadows. And this is a very important point, often overlooked, that to create a wildflower flower-rich meadow, you need a low nutrient soil. So in low nutrient soils, lots of plants compete for limited nutrients. You don't get the runaway winners like the ryegrass and the sorrel, dock, nettles, and other things. So this example from Hutchinson's Bank, right in the south of Croydon, shows an area where the topsoil has been scraped off more than 5 years ago, and that's had no mowing, nothing's been done to it at all. And that supports kidney vetch and birdsfoot trefoil and that sort of plant, and is teeming with small blues. It's a small blue paradise. Just to the right of it, you see what happens if you leave the topsoil there. It's very fertile, very thickly vegetated, and it quickly becomes overgrown with dogwood and then into scrub and then secondary woodland. So that's a very clear example of the difference between low nutrient and high nutrient soil. So how do you create a low nutrient soil? The good news is that most of London's parks, most parks generally, the soil is just ordinary soil. They don't make any effort to put high nutrient soil there. So it's relatively straightforward. If you use this cut and collect mowing regime, you can reduce the soil fertility. Essentially, there you let the grass grow tall, you cut it and take it all away. And you repeat, repeat, repeat. And the point is that the nutrients are in the leaves and are removed. So less to cut each time. Then you seed using native flower mix, and then cut late in the season. And there's an example of the Brilliant Science Butterflies project referenced there. As I come to a close now, I want just to mention a couple of resources. This iRecord Butterflies app is a really good free resource. It combines a spotter's guide, how to identify a butterfly, with a recording mechanism, which means that anything you see, the records go to the central database and are counted with all the others. Really handy. Fits on them just on your iPhone or Android phone. Less well known is this Butterflies Near Me website, which is produced by the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, which will give you a list of the butterflies that have been seen in your local area in the last few years. And that can be really handy to explore new places. So in conclusion, I think it's clear there's lots of wildlife in London. Encourage you to explore your local green spaces because there's probably quite a lot there, and submit what you see. But also take action. London could be a lot better. All the parks in London could have 20 or more species of butterfly if we manage them better than we do today. So take action for insects, engage with the land managers and owners. And let's create more wildflower meadows. Mowing regimes are really important, and both butterfly conservation and plant life have campaigns on this basis. And it's clear if you build it, they will come. In managing all the information to produce this talk and others, lots of people involved, and you can see the list here. BC itself, volunteers, the Friends of groups, the Wildlife Trust, the boroughs, and the Natural History Society in London all have a role to play. But to allow time for questions, I'm going to pause there and say thank you very much. Remember, there's nature under our noses. There's my contact details if you want to get in touch, and the website address is there too. I'll now pass back to Becky for a few more words. Thank you, Becky. We can do Q&A.
Yeah, we will begin the Q&A. We've got about 15 minutes left. So we'll start with Tracy. Said she's recently moved to Horsham, which is an urban area too. She's originally a South Londoner, born and bred, but is she right in saying that the elements we are putting in place here would work just as well there?
Yeah, I think Horsham is clearly in the countryside, so the butterflies, the difference in London is that if you're in the centre of London, the butterflies can't reach the countryside areas. They have to stay within the city. In Horsham, they can fly out, of course. But the sort of things I mentioned about wildflower meadows, road verges, areas in the green spaces managed for wildlife, planting the right sorts of trees and plants, all applies in any urban area, not just in London.
Okay, and Richard has asked, when do you cut the grass to benefit the marbled white?
Basically, as late as you can. So I saw there was a lovely site down in South London that I was visiting, Cannon Hill Common, teeming with marbled whites, and they cut it in July, and then all the marbled whites disappeared. But you need to be cutting in August or even September if you can, or even later.
Okay, and following on from that theme, Louise has asked, what exactly is the best time to cut grass late in the season to create a wildflower meadow?
Basically, as I said, basically as late as you can. If you look at the Plant Life campaign or the Building Science for Butterflies websites, which I showed you, they'll give you guidance. But basically, as late as you can, that doesn't leave it getting too untidy. And preferably leave some uncut. So if you're able to leave a third of it uncut each year for 3 years, that's even better, because then you've got some longer grasses just staying over the winter. Hard to do in a big area if it gets too big, but that's really helpful. You leave the margins, for example.
Okay, and Anonymous has asked, is holly a desirable plant for butterflies and or other wildlife?
It's quite a good place for birds and other things to roost in, I think. But it's also the food plant of the holly blue in the first brood. So it is an important food plant for the holly blue. So there's no reason not. It's a lovely tree to have. So I would say, yeah, plant holly trees. Yeah, why not?
And Rebecca has asked, what sparked your love for butterflies?
Yeah. Well, I was lucky enough to be born and brought up in rural Dorset, down in the Isle of Purbeck, where I could walk out of my door and into beautiful countryside and woods. And then when I was about 10, I think it was, a guy came to live in the village who was a retired RAF wing commander, and he was a really good butterfly enthusiast. He actually was one of the founders of butterfly conservation in Dorset. And he took me and a friend around to different wildlife sites and showed us things. So really sort of took my growing interest and let it flourish.
Okay, and Amanda has said, what can we plant in our gardens to encourage some of the rarer species?
It depends a lot where you are and what you mean by rarer species, I think. Because there are some species which are very rare, like the large blue or heath fritillary or high brown fritillary, checkered skipper and so on, which you're never going to get in a garden, really, too demanding. Similarly, the silver-studded blues and greylings, unless you happen to have a heathland garden, you wouldn't get those. So I would encourage you more to focus on things like garlic mustard, encouraging the orange tips, maybe changing your lawn to a lawn with birdsfoot trefoil instead of just grass, and then we get the blues coming in. Maybe if you've got a big enough garden, buckthorn trees would be great to have, and we get the brimstones. That's the sort of thing which I would recommend, rather than trying to really focus on the very rare ones in a small space like that. You need to think a bit more about the whole landscape, I think.
Okay. We've got a lot of gardening questions in. I think we've got a lot of keen gardeners tonight. So David has asked, is moss a problem plant in a wildflower meadow?
Moss? No, you wouldn't normally get in a wildflower meadow. It would normally be a bit too dry, I think, to have much moss. I certainly have a lot of, I've had lawns with a lot of moss in them, so I'm not a very good gardener. But no, I think if it's got moss, it's probably too wet, I would suggest. You probably want to be a bit drier than that and think about soil drainage, because a wildflower meadow typically is a relatively dry, well-drained habitat.
Okay, and going back to what you said, I think about leaving it late in the season, we've been asked, it's snowing here in West Yorkshire, but do the same measures apply up here too?
Snowing in West Yorkshire, I'm sorry for that. It's just been raining in London, I'm afraid. Yeah, same measure, same. The season will be shorter in the colder parts of the country. The butterflies will go into hibernation earlier, whether it's caterpillars or adults. They still need those places to hide. So they will still need that long grass to be there. And you could probably cut it a bit earlier in the colder climates, I guess, but I'm no expert on that. Maybe the Plant Life campaign will be able to tell you a bit more.
Okay, and Anonymous has said, this summer the flowers on the verges were wonderful. How significant are unmown verges, and how would you recommend approaching councils about this?
Well, unmown verges could be extremely important. And Highways England, it was reported in The Guardian, I haven't seen it elsewhere yet, but Highways England are supposed to be changing their mowing regimes for the road verges that they manage across England to encourage wildflower verges, which would be really, really big if that happened. But as an example, the one which we use as the best example is the Weymouth Relief Road, where the cutting was put through a chalk hillside for a road to go from Dorchester to Weymouth for the Olympics. The sailing was down there, and that was the road verges there were 7 hectares. They were left almost bare chalk, seeded with wildflower mixes, and now they support more than 30 species of butterfly only 8 years later. So it can be really, really significant. And the benefit of those road verges is they connect habitats of larger scale as well, so they provide corridors. And there are plenty of examples in Dorset and elsewhere of mowing road verges, as I've suggested for the mowing regime. So you follow this cut and collect mowing regime, and improving the wildlife, and so the flowers and insects, improving on those. And if you put into Google or whatever search engine you prefer on the verge, you will see there's a whole network of projects and initiatives under that name, starting off with one in Stirling, trying to do exactly that. So these are kind of grassroots, lobby the council. The good news is that the cut and collect mowing regime, once it's established, is cheaper than the commonly used regimes. The problem is to have to buy the capital equipment to change the mowers that they've got, and that can be expensive. But there are case studies, and if you go to the Building Sites for Butterflies website, you will see case study information there for that, and how to persuade the councils to change their regimes.
Okay, great. And Ruby has asked, are butterfly growing kits helping to increase numbers?
I don't think so really. When you think of the number of butterfly eggs which are laid each year overall, I think it's a nice thing to do. And I like to breed butterflies myself, just for fun, release them back into the sites where I found the caterpillars or eggs, making sure I don't do anything with rare species, of course. But I think those butterfly growing kits are great because they get people to really engage with the wildlife, and particularly for kids, to see the egg hatch into a caterpillar, the caterpillar to shed its skin 4 or 5 times, turn into a chrysalis, and have to wait until the butterfly comes out to watch the butterfly emerge. These are wonders of nature, and I think it's great for people to do that. I'll just encourage it. Mindful of where you get the stock from, you're not depleting any important wild populations.
Okay, and following on from that, Jackie has asked, I have seen butterfly houses on sale, like bird tables or insect houses. Do you think these are worth it, or the plants themselves will work just as well or better?
I would go for plants personally. I think there's something about seeing butterflies in the wild. No, I think I would encourage people to grow the right plants, encourage butterflies into their garden, or to spend time in the park, sitting by the flower border or the wild area, and just watching what's there. And it's amazing what you see if you spend 15 minutes looking.
Okay, and Mary has said, are butterflies in danger from birds?
Well, there's certainly food for birds, and moths are food for bats. But that's part of the food. That's part of the food web. That's part of the ecosystem. One of the reasons that songbirds have declined, people think, is many fewer moths than there used to be, because the moths eat dozens and dozens of caterpillars, and indeed blue tits and things do as well. Dozens and dozens of caterpillars every day. So I think you need to think of a bit more in the round that yes, butterflies are predated by birds and other insects and spiders and all sorts of things, but that's how it's meant to be. You need to have enough butterflies to go around, as it were.
Okay, and Douglas has asked, do you find comma caterpillars on your elms?
I'm not tall enough. I don't know. What I do know is that where I see stands of elms, I do see commas flying at the top of the elms as well as one of the hair streaks. So I'm pretty sure the commas are feeding on elms as well, but I've never found the caterpillars there because I haven't climbed up enough elm trees, I'm afraid.
Okay, and Sarah has said, how would we go about commissioning a butterfly survey on their local patch, the beautiful Wormwood Scrubs Common in West London? They have some rarities there and they'd love to have a definitive list.
I would suggest, I mean, if you want to drop me an email, I'll make sure you put you in touch with the Hertfordshire and Middlesex branch, which that site falls in. Wormwood Scrubs is a well-known site, and I believe there's a book on the butterflies of Herts and Middlesex, which was published last year, I think. I believe it mentions Wormwood Scrubs as a site. But if you drop me an email, I will send you what the information I've got. And the email is just simon.saville@gmail.com. I'll find out something for you. It's supposed to have lots of adders as well at Wormwood Scrubs, I think. I don't know. I don't think I've ever been there, though. Out of my territory, you see.
Okay, and Irene has said she does not see any caterpillars in winter. Are they easy to find?
No, they will be hibernating in places you can't see them, because if they're easy to see, then they'll be predated by birds and other insects and so on, and spiders and whatever. No, so I think they're quite difficult to see in winter. I've never found them. Not that I've looked. You can see eggs in winter, particularly the brown hair streak and purple hair streak eggs, if you know how to look for them, but not so easy to find caterpillars, I'm afraid.
Okay, Chris has said he only sees red admirals, whites and common blues in his 30-foot garden near Clapham Common. He has buddleia, ivy and nettles. What other strategies would you suggest to improve the butterfly count?
Well, if he's gotten, I would think more in a garden that size, it's probably more pollinator plants, more nectar plants, rather than anything else. If you've got space for blackthorn, for buckthorn, then that's good. If you don't mind having some bramble, that's also very good. If you plant some garlic mustard, you might get the orange tip. That sort of thing I would suggest. But depending where you are on Clapham Common, there's a lot of Clapham Common which isn't very good, and some bits which are quite good. So rather a lot of Clapham Common is managed as a miniature grassland, I'm afraid. It has to be. It's so heavily used. You only had to look at it in the middle of the lockdown when people were allowed out. It was like the Isle of Wight festival on one day. It was absolutely chock-a-block. But I think lobbying the council to do more on there would be good. It's managed by Lambeth Council, even though parts of it's in Wandsworth. So that's always a possibility.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for all that insight, Simon. But unfortunately, we have now run out of time. So apologies to those whose questions we weren't able to answer. But thank you for joining us, and we have hoped you all enjoyed it. One final reminder that the Big Give Christmas Challenge is live, and it's a unique opportunity this week to donate and have that donation doubled to help us do twice as much. So as I talked to you, we are heading towards the 17,000 mark of our £30,000 target. So there's still a long way to go in just 4 days. So if you enjoyed this evening's webinar and are able to help, any donation, whatever the size, is much appreciated. And you can see the link to that on the screen right now. So thank you once again for joining us, and we hope to see you all again soon. Good night from us.